Hey everyone, and welcome to Vassals of Kingsgrave's Agatha Christie Reread. Today we're doing episode 58, count 'em, 58 of Agatha Christie, and we're going to do a novel called Endless Night that was originally published in October 1967. My name is Bina007. I will be your host today, and we will be spoiler free to the end credits music. Today I am joined by the Winged Shadow.
Hey, it's Hannah.
And it's important we have Hannah on because this is one of her favorite Agatha Christie's. We also have popping his Agatha Christie cherry, Adam.
Hey, this is Adam, also known as Drowned Snow on the forums, and I was born to Sweet Delight.
Sweet delight, my friend. And then we have, last but not least, the Lord Baron, Zander.
Well, hello. I'm here. I'm Zander. I'm the Lord Baron.
Excellent. What a great crew for this novel. So before we get into our usual run through, let's just quickly go around and get some lemon cake ratings. So Adam, as you're newest to the podcast, maybe talk a little bit about your experience with Agatha Christie and how you found this novel.
Also, I guess I've not really read much Agatha Christie before this. You guys were doing the rereads, kind of got me interested. I'd read Murder on the Orient Express and then Death on the Nile, and I've seen a couple, film or movie adaptations of that. Delving into this a bit more, it's like you see the influence of Agatha Christie kind of everywhere. I'm like, oh, I've seen some of these stories kind of in other stories, TV shows, or whatever. And so I was like, I got to get on one of these. And so this one seemed very interesting. It was not what I expected going in because I was going in very blind, but I really enjoyed it. It had a good twist that I was not expecting at the end, and yeah, it was very well written and certainly a bit darker than probably your typical whodunit.
Yeah, this is definitely, it has elements of a puzzle mystery, but it's much more of a dark psychological thriller. And yes, I can imagine if you're expecting more of a sort of Murder on the Orient Express or Death on the Nile, this would have been a bit of a shock. How about you, Xander? How do you rate Endless Night?
So it has been a while since I've been in the Agatha Christie, but I'm gonna give this 5 out of 5 lemon cakes because
Yay.
it's the height of her career, it's the height of her writing ability. Like she's on point in this one, and I thoroughly enjoyed every moment.
Brilliant. And Hannah, do you want to talk about why you were so eager to get to this one? I know Cricket House was another of your favorites, right? But you were always mentioning this one as well.
Yeah, for sure. I give it 10 out of 10. I love this one. So I found this one, I think maybe during the pandemic or a little bit before, they had a deal on Audible where it's both this and Cricket House in one. So you for one credit
Oh, wow.
we can get them both, and the lovely narration by Fraser. He's probably one of my favorite like Audible artists, and he can do so many different voices, and they're really great. And then both of those, for me, it turned out to be because I had just come off of like Death on the Nile, Mysterious Affair at Styles, Murder at End House, Orient Express. I was rereading, and then there were none, and then I'd done ABC Murders, which are all like very top tier for me, and I really enjoyed. Then I found Crooked House in this, and like side by side, they are. It's a great pairing, and both of them are kind of a departure from her usual style, and especially so it goes Crooked House first, and then
Definitely
Endless
agree.
Night, and I went into it blind and just I had no idea what I was getting into, and the deeper it went, and it's just so different. It's so much more mature. I think as an author, like she has just grown so much by this point, and where all of most of the rest of her novels are like who done it, they're mysteries. This is more of a thriller, and yeah, it's just I love it. I think the characters are very rich. The writing is so superb, and it's just a really great ride to be. It's a slow burn, but it's so worth it, and it's
Yeah, that's
definitely
like,
in the top five.
well, it's a great introduction. I think I probably like it a little bit less than you, but I do love the tone. And I'm amazed again and again when I realized how old Agatha Christie was writing these. So she was 77 writing this book.
Whew.
And to have
Wow.
the mental acuity to be able to inhabit the voice, this is a first person narration in the voice of a
I'm a
young 20
20-year-old.
something British working class man, to be so deeply involved in a sort of psychosexual thriller. I think it's amazing. I think it
Yeah.
just speaks to how bright and smart she is. At this point, she is dictating her novels. She's on a dictaphone, she's not writing them. She loved this book. This is one of her favorite books if you read her autobiography. It's also one of the best reviewed of her books, and certainly one of the best of the 1960s versions, because I think a lot of reviewers thought she was getting a little bit spotty and patchy in quality. This comes after the Hercule Poirot book, Third Girl, which I think was a bit weaker. And it comes before By the Pricking of My Thumbs, which was the last Tommy and Tuppence, so more puzzle mysteries. But I think this is, for me, the undisputed champion of the 1960s books. But yeah,
Mhm.
writing in her 70s, she apparently wrote it really quickly too. She wrote it all in 6 weeks, and it just sort of it came forth from her. So I think you get some of that, and it feels so intense when you read it. I think that comes through.
Yeah, I think this is one
Um,
of the ones that's like the last big push of inspiration. And she might have been, I know it's been compared to one of the Miss Marple novels that like the underlying principle is as
mm,
a holdover from, I can't remember the name of it, but another Miss Marple novel from the 40s, I believe. And I'm not familiar with that novel, so I'm not sure how to make that comparison. But so she might have been sitting on some of the ideas for a while, but for her to write first person from a man, this, manifesto, and you never doubted. I mean, if she had put a ghost author name on it as a man, you would have never doubted that it was a man writing it.
yeah, absolutely. And it feels so of its time. Like it doesn't feel anachronistic. It doesn't feel like an old person writing a young
Right.
man. So
Very
it's based on
authentic.
so you're right, there is a Miss Marple short story from a while before, which is why it's so weird that when we come to adaptations, Miss Marple could have just adapted that story rather than doing this, trying to shoehorn Miss Marple into this version. Let's do some intros on like the social setting. So the title comes from the William Blake poem, Auguries of Innocence. Every night and every morn, some to misery are born. Every morn and every night, some are born to sweet delight. Some are born to sweet delight, and some are born to endless night. So I think that the very sinister tone comes from that. We get a lot of social change. We're in 1967. Ellie's uncle has died in the Korean War. I think this is interesting actually, because in the 40s and 50s, we had lots of relatives who died in World War II. So the war deaths are moving to the Korean War. And I put down a passage and I said, I wonder if this is how Agatha Christie felt about money. So Agatha Christie was born in quite a well-off family in a country house, but then the father died and the money went and she had to work. And that's when she started writing. Then, of course, by this point, she's fabulous. She's probably one of the richest women in the world, probably the richest woman in England after the Queen. Um, and this is how Mike Rogers, who's the protagonist, writes about, he's a working class boy who's going to marry a fabulously rich American. This is how he talks about the influence of money. I had been learning a great deal in the last few weeks. I'd stepped, as a result of marriage, into an entirely different world, and it wasn't the sort of world I'd imagined it to be from the outside. So far in my life, a lucky double had been my highest knowledge of affluence, a whack of money coming in and spending it as fast as I could on the biggest blowout I could find. Crude, of course, the crudeness of my class. But Ellie's world was a different world. It wasn't what I should have thought it to be, just more and more super luxury. It wasn't bigger bathrooms and larger houses and more electric light fittings and bigger meals and faster cars. It wasn't just spending for spending's sake and showing off to everyone in sight. Instead, it was curiously simple. The sort of simplicity that comes when you get beyond the point of splashing for splashing's sake. You don't want 3 yachts or 4 cars, and you can't eat more than 3 meals a day. And if you buy a really top price picture, you don't want more than perhaps one of them in a room. It's as simple as that. There's no moment when you say, I'm afraid I can't afford that one. So, in a strange way, it makes sometimes for such a curious simplicity that I couldn't understand it. I thought this was a really interesting passage, like what it feels like to have no money and then to come into a lot of money. But yeah, I thought I'd point that out. Not so much a social change, but an Agatha Christie change, at any rate. But the setup of the book is that Mike Rogers, our protagonist, is going to marry Ellie, who's a very, very rich American heiress. They want to build a new, very modernist house on a plot of land known as Gypsy's Acre. They are warned off by the local gypsy, and I think the young wife becomes very nervous. I think the husband sort of blows it all off. But eventually, the young wife is going to be thrown from her horse and killed in mysterious circumstances. And the question is, what was the cause and why? So that's the kind of the plot setup. Any thoughts on my Agatha Christie, what it must mean to be rich quote before we get into the events of the time?
I read somewhere that like her equivalent earnings would be $91 million today. But in her will, she only left what would be the equivalent of like $750,000. So she had like over her career accumulated quite a bit of wealth, but on her death, I guess money in, money out. So maybe that drives some of the attitude.
Or maybe she'd
She
given
did,
it away already, or
yeah, she did live at a high time of very high taxation post-war in the UK. So if you think of that Beatles song, Taxman, there was a
Yeah.
point where the highest rate of tax was excruciating, and she writes many letters moaning about taxation.
Yeah.
But I would hope it's more that she gave some away to friends and family and put it in trust for grandchildren and whatnot. But yeah,
The Kinks have a similar song, Sunny Afternoon.
yeah, exactly. The taxman's taken all I've got and left me with my stately yacht.
Yeah.
But it was a period when people were leaving the country, and I think these days we're so used to the idea that the stupidly rich billionaires don't pay any tax, and it's we working class people who are paying all the tax. But I think it genuinely was in those days that they had like proper taxation on the rich.
I will say that it almost feels like Agatha Christie both struggling and understanding her accumulation of wealth, even if she
Mm,
wasn't from the same background as Mike Rogers.
mm,
She still understands that like blue collar working class of wanting the riches. But as we'll see in this book, she, as she always does, kind of pokes at or, makes fun of when you have all the money, what really is there?
well, I
yeah,
mean, let's be fair. He didn't really want much. I mean, reading this book, he just didn't want to ever work. This is what it seemed.
Well,
That's what I got in
yeah,
the beginning. I was like,
exactly.
man, this guy
And
just can't keep a job.
and it it kind of like, and it sucks too. Like again, we'll get into this, but like I kind of relate to him in certain aspects, but I don't know how to like put it into words. This almost feels like more like a romantic book than a thriller,
yeah,
at least for the first three
hmm
quarters.
Yeah.
yeah,
I mean, you're
and
2/3 of the
deliberately
way through it
so.
before a body drops,
Yeah, I think we're meant to sympathize with him. We're meant to think, gosh, look at her awful family who are all trying to like cadge off her and intrude on her time. And then this weird relationship she has with sort of codependent, maybe sexualized relationship with Greta, her kind of au pair. And it's like this guy's going to come in and just rescue her from all these grasping people. And maybe they can
Yeah.
actually be happy together in their house. I mean, to me, it played like he was a bit like this working class knight in shining armor who was just going to take her away from all
He,
these
he
awful
just seemed
people.
kind of like a dope that was like, oh, he's maybe not good enough for her, but maybe he's good for her. And like I
Yeah.
was I was like Greta was sus the whole time.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and that's why I find it so interesting. She chose to make Mike the British character and her the American character because he comes off more American than Ellie does.
Yeah, which is interesting, right? Because
Hmm.
there's a reverse of this in by nationality, and they do it with Mirrors, which is another Miss Marple, I believe, where we have a sort of a working class American guy who has met this very rich English woman. So he's American. He's now living with her in England in this sort of country manor that's been converted into a reform school. But he used to run a petrol pump, right, which is one of the jobs Mike Rogers does, and he feels really uncomfortable with this life that he's kind of come into through the war, just throwing them together. And that, yeah, so, but here it's the British working class guy and the rich American. I mean, Agatha Christie does have a fondness for rich American poor little princesses, right? We get that character in Death on the Nile as well. We
Yeah.
get it in The Mystery of the Blue Train, Rufus Van Elden's daughter. These kind of preyed upon rich princesses for sure appear again and again.
Well, I mean, there's quite a lot of her novels that the motivation is money related.
Mm.
Most of them are either money or love or both in some cases, they're mixed
In
in.
fact, I'd go further. I'd say it's money or sex or both. Like she
Yeah.
is very
So
aware of sexual impulses, right? Okay, so let's give a bit of sort of context for when this Christie for Christmas would have dropped. It's worth saying that the publishers were a bit nervous about this book as a Christie for Christmas. When she wrote it, she dictated it. It was purely that kind of romance that flips into thriller. And they were like, oh, Agatha, maybe you need to introduce some kind of like red herrings and more puzzle mystery elements. And she was like, I really don't want to. They're like, yeah, but that's what people expect. So she had to kind of shoehorn in a few random characters and red herrings. And once I knew that, I was like, oh, that makes so much sense. And it's such a shame she
So,
kind of gave in.
are you saying this is like a Christmas novel? Is that when this came out?
No,
Was
no,
like,
no. She basically, in her peak years in like the 30s and 40s, Adams, she was publishing 3, 4, 5 novels a year in various guises. But when she became older, so it kind of fell into a cadence in the mid 50s and into the 60s. She would publish a book every year. It was usually around November. And idea is not that it's a Christmas novel, but that you buy it for your
you
loved
buy it?
ones
Oh,
at
okay,
Christmas.
because it's like, hey,
Yeah,
Agatha's got something new this Christmas. Okay, because I just had a
exactly.
whole thought about how like did she invent the Hallmark movie, but in reverse? Like big city,
That'd
big
be
city
so
rich
cool.
woman comes meets this small town man. You know, they build a house together.
She does
Um,
have two explicitly Christmassy ones, though, if you're interested, Adam. She has Hercule Poirot's Christmas, which is set at Christmas, and then she has a short story as well about sort of Hercule Poirot at Christmas time. So you can check those out. But no, I mean, then as now, right? October, November are the big book selling months of the year as people buy big
right.
hardbacks for as gifts. So yeah, the publishers were like, but people want a puzzle mystery with like Poirot or Miss Marple. So if you're giving us neither, can we at least have some clues to like stuff and solve stuff? And they would have been unhappy the murder doesn't drop till so late. But yeah, I'm glad she resisted. And it's interesting to me that some of her most, the books that people think of as her most accomplished, like And Then There Were None, and this tend not to be the Poirots and the Miss Marples. They tend to be the standalone, more thrillerish, darker ones, for sure. Um, okay, so this dropped as a Christie for Christmas in 1967. So between the last book dropping and this, what was the context the reader was getting this book in? Well, in December 66, we had the first ever Kwanzaa. Didn't know that. Kwanzaa never really, I mean, it's not a thing in England, so I guess maybe I wouldn't. January 67, in Munich, the trial begins of Wilhelm Harster, accused of the murder of 82,856 Jews, including Anne Frank. It's kind of amazing to me that Holocaust sort of trials were still having to be prosecuted this late on. In England, Milton Keynes, which is a new town, was founded. And it's interesting because there's a big debate at the moment because we're so short of houses whether we should found more new towns. And also Apollo 1, US astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee are tragically killed when fire breaks out in their Apollo spacecraft during a launch pad test. Any comments on that stuff? Apollo 1, I feel, is very iconic as a thing. March 1967, the Velvet Underground's first ever album is released in the US. Originally a flop, but obviously now seen as iconic. The classic Pirates of the Caribbean attraction opens at Disneyland, California. Is that still running? Is that still a thing?
Oh
Presumably the
yeah.
movies.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
goodness.
it's been redone to match the movies
Yes,
a little bit.
several iterations of revamping, but yes, it's still at its heart the same ride.
That's kind of insane. April 67, the first Boeing 737 takes its maiden flight. Clearly, the 737 is still airborne. The AFTRA strike is settled in time for the 39th Academy Awards. The best picture goes to A Man for All Seasons. So, for all of you watching Wolf Hall and the Life of Times of Henry VIII, if you haven't seen A Man for All Seasons, go watch it. It's one of the all-time great films, in my humble opinion. And in Houston, Texas, boxer Muhammad Ali refuses military service. He is stripped of his boxing title and barred from professional boxing for the next 3 years. Ah, so sucky. May 67, Elvis Presley and Priscilla Beauty are married in Las Vegas. What an epic era for music. The Jimi Hendrix Experience released their debut album, Are You Experienced? Again, one of the all-time iconic
One of the
albums.
best albums, yeah.
I remember the first time I heard that, I must have been about 8 because my big cousin was going through this whole wanting to be a guitarist thing. It was like, I can't describe it. It was like revelatory hearing that album. It's amazing,
It
its power.
100% agreed.
Yeah. Okay, June 67, 'Twas Ever Thus. Sometimes I feel like reading these, history just goes in a loop. The Six-Day War begins. Israel launches Operation Focus, an attack on Egyptian Air Force airfields. The Allied armies of Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and Jordan invade Israel. And then we have a court case that's very important to my husband and I. June 67, Loving versus Virginia. The United States Supreme Court declares all US state laws prohibiting interracial marriage to be unconstitutional.
Boo.
Boo, beat that. And actually, interestingly, the legal wiring of that case then goes to the legal kind of wiring of when they made gay marriage legal. So my husband and I, in our darker moments, we think, God, if they ever wanted to go for gay marriage, maybe they'd go for Loving versus Virginia too. The first automatic cash machine, voucher-based, is installed. Where do you think it's going to be installed? I would have thought New York, London, Frankfurt, Zurich, but no. It's installed in an office of Barclays Bank, which is a big high street bank in Britain, but in Enfield, England, which is like a suburban town. It's not where I would have thought a revolutionary technology would first make its debut. It's kind of amazing to me the ATM is that old. July 67, the EEC, so that's the European Economic Community, joins with the European Coal and Steel Community. And basically, this is going to become the European Union. This is the kind of underpinnings of that, which, of course, Britain will leave when Brexit in 2016, controversially. The other thing that blew my mind is that this was the year of the first UK colour television broadcasts. And what do you guys predict is the first thing we Brits chose to broadcast in colour on TV on the BBC?
Oh, I saw this the other
Doctor
day.
Who.
I'm trying to remember. Oh, because there was a video that had like all of the broadcasts as they switched from like black and white to color, and the British one was. Oh, I remember it being like that. I'm thinking like that's very British. What was it?
You're going to kick yourself when I tell you. It's the Wimbledon Tennis Championships.
Yes.
I was like, could you get more cliched, man? Is that or a royal wedding, isn't it? Like, what could be more cliched than that?
Like some of them like went to had these big productions and like did this whole big thing to introduce color, and British was just like, here it is.
It's also the month in which British Parliament decriminalises homosexuality, thank goodness. Well, let's all remember that
Yay.
lesbianism was never illegal because Queen Victoria didn't believe that women could have sex.
Really?
Yeah, because they thought that, I mean, in general, the Victorians thought that sex was like involving a penis, right? And actually, I think that if I'm right, if you read like rape law in some countries, including I think my own, you cannot be raped technically unless it involves a penis.
Yeah, I know some
So
countries do have that like
That's
right in the
yeah,
problematic.
law.
yeah, that is problematic.
Very problematic. Very.
But anyway,
I'm
let's
pretty
just
sure
be thankful
here.
that homosexuality is no longer illegal in summer of 67, thank goodness. October 67, the musical Hair opens off Broadway,
Oh boy.
where everyone gets butt naked. I've never seen it though. I don't know do they even still do hair?
They
Is
do.
that a thing?
Yep. Hmm.
Awesome balls.
A lot
God
of
bless them.
times they'll do it with like modesty garment, so it's nude, but it's not total nudity. And there's some states where you can't perform it full nudity, still because you have to have special licenses to do any burlesque that involves bottomless nudity.
Ah, okay. We also in October 67 get the release of my all-time favorite kids Disney film, which is The Jungle Book. It's the last of the Disney films personally supervised by Walt Disney, who I know is a problematic figure. But oh my God, that film is so good. The music is just so awesome. Oh, and it's going to have a link to Endless Night because the guy who voiced Shere Khan the tiger, George Sanders, plays Uncle Andrew Lippincott in the film of Endless Night. I just realized that.
Huh.
Anyway, it's such a good film. And we were watching the movie this morning over coffee, and Uncle Andrew, who's now by this point quite old, and I was like, who is that actor? And as soon as he says something, the voice, it is just Shere Khan the tiger. You cannot, that is one of the most unique voices in film history, I think. More seriously, in October 67, Charles de Gaulle vetoes British entry into what will become the EU. So, our relationship with the Europe has always been complex. And in Britain, maybe another sign of growing liberalism in Britain, homosexuality made legal in July, and in October, the Abortion Act 1967 passes in the British Parliament, receiving royal assent 2 days later. So women no longer have to have backstreet abortions. Again, I can't believe this is all being recontested, but there we are. Not in my country, at least, but yeah, it seems all very relevant, doesn't it now? Any thoughts on all of that? The environment in which newly liberal, progressive things going on, but a world of amazing music, but geopolitical instability, particularly in the Middle East. A lot going on there.
That's really good context. I had no idea any of that going through the story, which I mean, kind of looking back helps. For some reason, I thought this was like one of her earlier works, not one of her later works. Just in my head, I don't know why I thought
It's
that,
because it's
but
so sharp. I was the same way when I first read it. I thought it would be, closer to like, and then there were none Orient Express, but no,
yeah,
actually.
Yeah, some of
I did the
them,
same.
some of them are very obviously in the 60s because she talks about hippies and LSD and like, long haired hipster girls getting high. So, like some of the 60s ones are very obviously 60s. This isn't. And I would also say that sometimes in the popular imagination, because a lot of those TV adaptations are kind of backward induced to the 30s, like even the Miss Marple version of this is set in the 50s, like it's put back a
Hmm.
decade. So people always think they're older than they are, which I think does Agatha Christie a disservice because actually she did try and move with the times and she did try and show how society was changing. So yeah, it's
I will,
yeah.
I will say that, like, it's been a while since I've been on the Agatha Christie reread, but I feel like this one, I at least knew, like, it was, later. I could see the growth of her writing, the growth of her interests, and, like, she really does have a pinpoint on, like, the social ideals of people throughout times,
Mm.
throughout decades, and we have it in written form.
Yeah. Yeah, I read the one that comes after this by the pricking of my thumbs. And it was phenomenal actually, because I thought, gosh, when we start with Agatha Christie, where everyone's going everywhere on the train, there are very few motor cars. Like Bundle Brent has a motor car because she's a very rich woman, but there's no like traffic on the roads or road laws. You just drive because you're rich and you have a car. And then by the time you get to this point, we have suburban housing developments, we have motorways. And actually, the trains are dying out. And at one point, Tuppence is like bemoaning the fact that half the railway lines have closed down because people now just drive everywhere. So, that was 1920s through to 1960s. She moves with the times. Anyway, let's get into the characters of the book. So we have Michael Rogers, the protagonist. He's a bit of a Rolling Stone, cannot keep hold of a job, has a kind of like weird relationship with his mum, like doesn't even invite her to his own wedding. He had a job for some time as a chauffeur to very rich people, and he seems to have acquired, a taste for the finer things in life, including meeting a very famous architect called Santonyx, which is such a great name, who he decides that if he ever kind of suddenly came into a fortune, he'd get him to build him an amazing modernist house in a hill. But what do you guys think of Michael Rogers? I mean, like, spoiler free, first two-thirds of the novel. Does he work for you as a kind of romantic adventurer? Is he charming? Because he's meant to be charming, I think, to both men and women. I think there's a sort of a hint maybe that Santonyx might take a shine to him as well, that he doesn't object to too much.
yeah. Other than the mom, he seems like most people kind of like him. Like he doesn't really have a lot going as far as a career path or a future necessarily, but it just seems like people are like, oh yes, kind of a cool guy. Except probably his employers don't like him. He seems to be a shit worker.
Yeah. But meant to be very good looking, I think.
So because I did this on Audible, Hugh Frazier for Mike Rogers, who does this really fantastic, it's like kind of a Geordie accent for him.
Oh,
So,
wow.
which I feel like, just fits in so many ways. And I can get into more about why later, but it really does paint this picture of sort of, I don't know, I identified with him. Like I've always been poor and, never had the luxury of traveling much and lots of fancy things, but I obviously admire fancy things when I see them. And he seems like he's very Johnny on the spot as far as being able to engage with people and develop relationships with people, regardless of their
Yeah.
position in life. And
Except his
that's
mom.
something I identify with a lot.
And he's
So
definitely more sympathetic than all the sort of sponging rich relatives who are sort of always trying to like, touch Ellie for
mhm.
money, right? So there's something about, okay, he's not really held on to a job or whatever, but at least he's sort of he's very honest about what he wants, and you kind of do feel like he's going to give Ellie a good life and just get her out from under all of these people. So,
I
Yeah, I felt
I
this was
think
like a
it
chosen family type story because like his mom I feel like he was like abused and his mom like
right,
did not give a shit. And then she doesn't like her parents had died and like she doesn't really have a great family necessarily. Like she's having to be, kind of the matriarch like way too young and all that. And I'm like, "Oh, so they've got each other now." I was like,
right.
"Where?" But
mm,
the whole time like, "Where is this going?" I'm like, who's gonna be murdered? What's gonna happen?"
And like
Um
building a dream together, like like before he meets Ellie, he's just passionately in love with this piece of land and this dream of having a home. So the relationship with the mother, I think, informs that why building a home is so important to him. And he is realistic about, like, I'm gonna look but I can't buy. So he goes and takes a look and then he leaves empty handed, and it's like, ah, what a damn shame. Then he goes back and he meets Ellie and he again falls like madly in love with her and has no idea about her money. So it's just really a true love and a true, yeah, we're gonna build this together. And then when he finds out about the money, it's like, oh, okay, well, that's great, but that's not why I love you, kind of thing. So I think he's
how do
he's
you guys
very
feel about
endearing.
Ellie?
What?
He's so
Well,
charming and charismatic, but how do you feel about Ellie? Because I used to get quite sort of annoyed with her in the first bits of the book. She just came across as such a sop. I know she's meant to be very young, so when the book opens, she's just turning 21, which is pivotal because it means that she becomes an adult and she can manage her own money. But she is very, very childlike, isn't she? And sort of a bit, I don't know. She's no
and
like if you think of
yeah.
Death of the Nile, and the sort of the rich princess in that. I mean, she's very strident, Lynette Doyle. She's got a good head for business, and she knows exactly what she wants, and she gets it. Whereas this is I don't know. But then she does sneak out, right? She does sneak out on her family and go meet him.
Yeah,
So maybe
she's not
they.
like the insufferable rich girl who's spoiled or like overly dramatic and, a martyr. I don't know. I thought it was kind of the right blend for her age and everything. Like
Mm,
when he says like poor little rich girl, I'm kind of like, well, like I sort of get both sides of that, but like she seemed like she had gaps in her, I don't know, social awareness that were like expected. That you know what I mean? Not
Yeah.
necessarily like she was, a shitty person, just like, well, this is how she's grown up, and like, yeah, I get it.
mm,
She reminded
see,
me of, what is her name? Darcy's sister in Pride and Prejudice, Joanna. Is that
mm-hmm.
the name? She reminds me a lot of her. So sort of kind of a little bit, the
Is it
parents
Joanna?
died, so
Is
you
it
have
Georgina? It might be Georgina,
Georgina,
something
yeah.
like that. Yeah.
Georgiana. Yeah, her. She reminds me of her a lot. Like I have that very like picture in my head of a little bit weak, a little bit like protected, but not necessarily guided. Because like the parents are dead, so she's sort of being raised by Greta, but also lawyers. Like it's really her attorneys that are her disciplinarians and stuff, and that's kind of a
Yeah,
really hollow, distant sort of relationship to have. They're not peers. They work for her. They don't really love her. I mean, so I think
yeah,
growing up in adolescence with that dynamic kind of would leave you a little bit simpering and a little unsure of yourself and just a little
Yeah.
bit weak.
were you
And I have,
automatically suspect of all the money people? I was.
yeah, always.
I would suspect
well,
of
see, okay,
everybody that except for Mike and Ellie. And then two
see,
thirds of the
so
way through the book, you're still like nothing, like there isn't a who done it yet because it hasn't happened yet.
Yeah,
And,
you're like,
and then
someone investigate that gypsy woman.
it's just so different. you know?
well, see, so I wanna just say, like, to go back a little on Bina's question about, like, were you sympathetic with Mike? Did you relate to him? Like, and also like how you, Hannah, said, like, I also come from a poor background, so immediately I want to relate to him. But
Mm.
in the same sense, I immediately disliked him and knew something was wrong with him, or just felt uncomfortable with something.
Ooh.
But I did love Ellie because it could be the innocence of her, really.
Mm.
But again, Agatha wrote this as such a, I think, romantic novel over a thriller 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And even
I,
people say, don't they, it's a house for love. Like, I mean, it is meant to be seen as romantic. Me and you against the world, girl, that kind
Yeah,
of
even the ending is kind of romantic, right? I mean,
mm.
yeah.
Don't get
Exactly,
into
yeah.
it yet, but
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
it
I'm not
is.
gonna go there,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
I think, yeah, Xander, that's probably a better word for her, is like innocent and maybe slightly not the brightest. Like she doesn't have like the comparison with Linda Doyle. She doesn't have acumen in managing her own money, and she's
I
just
mean,
kind
if
of,
we
yeah,
wanna,
damsel in distress.
well, if we want to put it in a modern phrase, she's essentially like that mini pixie girl or whatever,
Mm. Yeah,
Mhm.
Manny
that
Pixie
kind of
Dreamgirl.
state. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah, that's a good one. I
Yeah.
like Ellie, and I think that, it's amazing how they moved to
Same.
this little village where none of them really, like she immediately becomes friends with Claudia Hardcastle, and Major Film Potts is very fond of her. The doctor of the village is obviously very fond of her. Like everyone seems to immediately become quite protective and fond of her. So I think she is genuinely quite lovely. Let's contrast her with a third person in this apparent, well, not necessarily a love triangle, but it's certainly the case that I think Mike is jealous of Greta's relationship with Ellie and the attention that she takes. So Greta Anderson is Ellie's Scandinavian blonde companion, in the way that in Agatha Christie books, which typically older people have companions who kind of travel with them and almost are like chaperones. She sort of manages and organizes her life. This is the description we get from Mike. I've never had. Sorry. I'm never any hand at describing people, but I'll have a shot at describing Greta. To begin with, one couldn't deny that she was, as Ellie had said, very beautiful, and also, as Mr. Lippincott had reluctantly admitted, very handsome. The two things are not exactly the same. If you say a woman is handsome, it does not mean that actually you yourself admire her. Mr. Lippincott, I gathered, had not admired Greta. All the same, when Greta walked across the lounge into a hotel or in a restaurant, men's heads turned to look at her. She was a Nordic type of blonde with pure gold corn coloured hair. She wore it piled high on her head in the fashion of the time, not falling straight down on each side of her face in the Chelsea tradition. You see there, Agatha Christie is referring to her hipster girls in Chelsea. She looked what she was, Swedish or North German. So obviously she's meant to be a real blonde bombshell. And I spent the first kind of time I was reading this, like a lot of time stressed out about Greta. And I just thought it was a very manipulative relationship, that Ellie was very sort of like dependent on her, and that maybe there was something even like sexual about it, or certainly there was a jealousy on
Mm.
Mike's part, that he's the husband and he should have his wife's full attention in that manner. And that, yeah, I would be pissed off like if I got married to someone and then the best friend woman just kept tagging along in a threesome. I mean, it's just ridiculous. So,
Absolutely.
how do you guys feel about Greta in the first parts of the book?
I will say I love that throughout the entire book, Mike's like, yeah, I'm not good at art or describing things, and then goes on to describe the entire everything perfectly.
Mm,
But no, she's stressful for sure because you feel
yeah.
it through Mike.
And all the other men, right? I think even one of
Right.
Ellie's cousins, Stamford Lloyd, he's a bit of a shit, always touching her up for money. I mean, he kind of like fancies Greta too. I think you see the impact of Greta on people. It is interesting that you don't meet her until a way through. So you get everyone kind of warning Mike, like, oh, is Greta going to come live with you? How are you going to get her away from Greta? So it is a bit like the shark in Jaws. Like it's like when you finally meet her, it's like, okay, now we get to make our own judgment. And she does seem to kind of wheedle her way in for sure. We also have some other family members. We've got in the village Claudia Hardcastle, who goes riding with Ellie and shares her allergy to horses. We also have family members who are based in America. So you have Cora Van Stuyvesant, Ellie's stepmother, who relies on Ellie for money. We have Uncle Andrew Lippincott. So we have an Uncle Andrew in Death on the Nile in here too. He's Ellie's guardian and trustee, a Bostonian who very much disapproves of Greta's influence over Ellie. And then we have Stamford Lloyd, who's Claudia Hardcastle's former husband and another one of Ellie's trustees. I think they're meant to be cousins, aren't they? And then you have Frank Barton, the husband of Ellie's aunt, a man who, quote, borrows but does not return. Oh, this is quite a fun description. This is what Mike says of Uncle Frank. I wouldn't have trusted him a yard. I had come across the same type in England. He was a big man with a bit of a paunch and pouches under his eyes that gave him a dissipated look, which was not far from the truth, I imagine. He had an eye for women, I thought, and even more of an eye for the main chance. He borrowed money from me once or twice, quite small amounts, just as it were, something to tide him over for a day or two. So he's a bit of a shady character. So those are the sort of the family members, and then of course there's Major Philpot, the village god, who befriends Michael, his wife. There's the village doctor. So those are the sort of the cast of characters. Any of the family members that you want to sort of call out there? I mean, we're given quite a cast, and I suspect that was also fleshed out partly because Agatha Christie was trying to give us red herrings and more of a puzzle mystery. Any of those characters stand out?
I mean, Stanford Lloyd, obviously, I was like, fuck that dude.
he's
Just
he's if you read enough Agatha Christie, you think he's going to be blackmailing someone. He's going to be like the second murder.
you're like,
Right.
something's gonna come up with this dude. Something's gonna come up. He owes somebody some money. Like, what's going on?
Yeah, exactly. Or he's going to be a feckless drug addict or something. Yeah. Sorry,
Yeah.
Xander. You okay with me?
No, sorry. I did like God. I thought he was, I don't know, probably my favorite secondary character.
Oh, Major Philpot, yes. Every local village.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
We had someone like that in the little village where my parents now live when they moved there, and his name was Roy, but everyone called him Chairman Roy because he was almost like the self-appointed chairman of the village, like nothing would happen without.
See,
Kind
I
of
want to live somewhere
well-meaning,
with
but
a guy
just
like
like
that.
self-appointed as running shit. Oh, and they always are like slightly older, maybe semi-retired, like too much time on their hands. Oh,
The
village life
Colonel.
does not
Exactly.
change. It really does not change. Oh dear.
I was
Any other
I was definitely sus of Cora for like the
yeah,
entire book. Like,
the wicked stepmother. Yeah. Although like,
yeah.
you know what? In a way, I think some of those minor characters are good because they do point out the weirdness of the Greta relationship and their hostility to Mike. I mean, Uncle Andrew wondering if he can buy him off. I mean, that is what you would do. I mean, if you had a niece or whatever it is who was like, the sixth richest girl in America, and she shows up with like a petrol pump attendant, unemployed petrol pump attendant, you'd be like, what the?
Oh, absolutely. What?
Well,
How much of a check should I be offering?
Yeah, exactly.
so what I really find fascinating in this, and it was like, I need more, more, more. Couldn't put it down. Is the whole deal like so they're advising Ellie against Mike, but Mike is advising Ellie against like the same things basically. Like
Mm,
unbeknownst to them, he's in league with them. He's like, your relationship with Greta is weird. I don't want her here. It's time to cut that purse string, like, or that umbilical cord, and you can do it on your own, babe.
yeah.
Like he's looking out for her in the same way that they're like cautionary about him, you know.
Yeah, which maybe is
And
why
so
Uncle
it's
Andrew
so
gives them
to
a bit
me,
of a pass. Yeah, because they're all in
yeah.
league against Greta, which is why. I mean, Greta is the one I was really worried about when I was first reading this, for sure.
Well, yeah, like her
Which
and Mike
takes us.
fight like cats and dogs, and it's like how are you not putting like two and two and then three together, like
Mm,
as far as Ellie goes, which is again I think where she comes off a little naive.
yeah. Okay, well, let's transition to whether the novel holds up to a modern reader. And Adam, I don't know if you listen to early episodes, but when you're in the 20s and 30s, there is a lot of blatant racism, anti-Semitism, just horrible, horrible stuff. A lot of that wears off. I mean, the obvious thing to talk about in terms of progressive, regressive is just referring to gypsies as gypsies and when gypsies acre and all the cliches that they want money, that they're liars, that they're sort of,
Is gypsy considered like
thieves.
not a term to be used anymore, or like
No,
what?
in England we
I
would
mean,
call them travellers or Roma
Romany
or
or something. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Well, not
Yeah.
even Roman, yeah, but
I don't
travellers
know.
typically. This is what's said of Mrs. Lee. I expect she wants money, said my mother. Gypsies are like that, make a big song and dance sometimes of how they've been done down one way or another. But they soon stop when they get some money in their itching palms. You don't like gypsies, said Ellie. They're a thieving lot. They don't work steady and they don't keep their hands off what doesn't belong to them. And I would say a lot of those attitudes still prevail in contemporary and English society. That they're thieves, that they're kind of living on the wrong side of the law. In a way, that's kind of sad to see how enduring that is. But yeah, we just wouldn't call them gypsies anymore. I think that has changed.
So when was like, because I'm reading Mysterious Affair at Styles. When was that? Is that one of her earlier books?
That's the earliest, so that's the very early 1920s. So
Okay, because
this is
there's
like
very casual, like,
always,
well, I'm not sure about him. He has that Jew blood, and you're like, well, a little bit
yeah,
of
yeah,
Jewish blood
yeah.
is okay. And I'm like, oh God, like,
The
there's just
anti-Semitism radically falls after World War
there's
II, as
no
you would hope.
pushback at all to the Jewish comments in that book, and I was like, oh, well, I mean, I guess it'd probably be accurate to the time, but damn.
I mean, I think
Yeah,
that's the
so like
value of reading Agatha Christie is that because she was the best-selling author of her time all the way through her career. So I think what she says and what doesn't have pushback is very representative of the readers would have been very much in agreement with it, right? Like she's a very good
That's just how people thought.
bellwether. Yeah.
Hmm.
So you can see that the overt racism, the use of the N word, the C word, that all those kind of things does fall off after World War II. It doesn't go completely. And I think it becomes more subliminal. So in all of Agatha Christie, rich Americans are typically Jewish. And it's interesting that the maiden name of Ellie's, like her family, or that there is a hint that maybe it's Jews who've made all of this amazing money. So there is some of that lingers on, which Americans are always stupidly rich, though, Adam, typically. Apart from the petrol pump attendant in They Do It with
Yeah.
Mirrors, they're all filthy rich.
Well, I mean, and back then too, like traveling wasn't as easy as it is now. So yeah, if you're running into an American who's out there just kind of just relaxing, like they probably have some degree of money, right?
Yeah. But I mean, there's books like, I mean, if you read Death in the Clouds, which I guess is 30s from memory, there's a scene
yeah.
where the two lovers are in a cafe in London and they're talking about things I like I like jazz records. Oh, I like jazz records too. I love the cinema. Oh, I love having pre-workout too. And then they bond over the fact that they both hate the N word. And it's like the people that word represent. And you're just like, what the
Oh, like
hell?
not like the word
Yeah.
itself, but like, oh, we're
No, no,
against people
no,
using that
no.
despicable word.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
No, racistly.
Sorry,
We've
Hannah,
Like,
you were
oh,
saying
I'm so
something.
glad you can be a bigot like me. Yes, excellent.
Yeah, they bonded over bigotry. Yeah.
so
I
so
mean,
Adam,
yeah.
we've talked extensively on this reread of like gone back and forth on are these sympathies that Agatha Christie shares or is she writing characters similar to the way like if you read The Stand by Stephen King, there's a lot of use of the N-word and stuff. I don't think you could really accuse Stephen King of being a racist himself though, but the character he's writing is
Yeah,
because
King, I
he's
wouldn't, but I mean,
a big
back
history of
then,
people that really exist, you know?
yeah.
So
Mm.
we've kind of had that discussion on and off of is she just writing very hyper realistic characters and not
I
necessarily
Would these
And I
sharing
think
be
it's
those
like
both.
banned
feelings?
in like
It
a
is both,
modern,
isn't it? Yeah.
context, for these references? You know what I mean? Would this be something that like they wouldn't let the kids read at high school?
No, no, no. This would have been,
well,
I
I
don't know.
mean, they read Catcher in the Rye in high school, and isn't this the same story?
But
Kind of.
sometimes that gets banned too, right? You know what I'm saying? Like, just depends on where you are.
So it is interesting, Adam. We've had examples where, because we're reading different editions, like English, American editions, different like secondhand, firsthand, old ones, new ones. And there are elements that have been taken out and then elements that have not been taken out in modern printings. So some of the
Oh,
more egregious stuff has been taken out. But weirdly, and this would speak to David Baddiel's argument that Jews don't count, a lot of the anti Semitism has stayed in. So a lot of the really awful anti-black stuff has been taken out, but the anti-Jew stuff has stayed in, and all the homophobia has stayed in. So, for instance, I read this in an absolutely bang-on modern copy, and there's a really interesting kind of like a bit of a throwaway where Mike Rogers he's really into his art, isn't he? So he's talking about passing pictures in a window. And then just check out this. Just three pictures in the window, artfully arranged with a drape of limp velvet in some neutral colour arranged over a corner of a gilt frame. Sissy, if you know what I mean. So, I mean,
Mhm.
that's
oh,
not
right,
great.
right.
Yeah, I
That's
caught
not great.
that.
So, but I wonder because
Yeah.
I haven't read enough of these. You could answer this for me. Um, is it ever used as like, oh, kind of like the shittier people that we don't like are the ones making these references, or
Sometimes. So
um,
sometimes she wants to say, like, especially in the more modern ones, she'll have people who are really bigoted and anti-foreigner, and you can tell she's disapproving of them, and we're meant to too. But
right, right.
sometimes in the earlier ones, that's just how she feels.
Yeah,
When
because
she'd
like
write
with
the man in
Styles,
the
I was
brown
like,
suit.
I don't think
Yeah.
it just they were all
Yeah.
like, yeah, oh yeah, the Jew thing, and you were like, hmm.
Yeah.
I
And
mean,
that
Perot
continues
didn't really
quite
say much
late.
about it.
Jews being sallow skinned and hook nosed and greedy and thieving and rich. That goes to at least the mid 30s, for sure. And even Lynette Doyle, who's very, very rich in American and Death on the Nile, she's very clear to point out that the antecedents of that money are Jewish. That's Jewish money. So yeah, there are some pretty. But it just tells us how people thought at the time. The other one that's going to blow your mind is the novel "And Then There Were None," which was originally called 10 Little N Words. And immediately the American
I'm
publishers
sorry.
yeah.
What?
So
Yep,
immediately
correct.
in the 1940s, the American publisher was like, you can't call it that here, that'll be incendiary. So they renamed it 10 Little Indians, which of course now we would also
Which
find
now would
racially
be
offensive.
Yeah.
because that's the same thing anyway. Wow.
But bear in mind the title was only changed from 10 Little N-words to 10 Little Indians in England. When do you think they changed that? Like, if it was too bad in the 1940s,
Oh,
when
good
do you
lord.
reckon? When do you reckon that was changed in England, man?
This century, this
90s.
millennium.
No, 1980s, but still.
Oh, okay, I don't know. Whatever I guess is gonna be wrong.
Put it this one. Me as a little brown girl, the only brown girl in my all-white private school that I was there on scholarship, found a copy in the school library to read. That was the first time I read it. And it was called 10 Little N-Words. And the hilarious thing is, I didn't even notice that that was offensive because that was still in the popular culture to use that word. So,
Oh,
little 8-year-old Dina.
yikes.
I know. There you go.
No
Anyways,
way.
so
No, that's
Adam,
something.
we caught, yeah. So when you go from the 20s to the now, there are big differences. But, so basically I would say the gypsy thing, a little bit of light homophobia, but it's not too bad. There are far worse books, right, for progressive, regressive. Anything
I
else
mean,
that I
is there
missed
ever?
that stood out to you
Yeah.
that was not good? Okay, so let's go to reviews. This was really well reviewed relative to our other works of the 60s. Let's have a look if we've got some. The Times Literary Supplement of November 67. It really is bold of Agatha Christie to write in the persona of a working class boy who marries a poor little rich girl. But in a pleasantly gothic story of gypsy warnings, she brings it off together with a nicely melodramatic final twist. We had a review in the Guardian newspaper. The old maestrina of the crime novel, or whatever the female of maestro is, pulls yet another out of her inexhaustible bag with Endless Night, quite different in tone from her usual work. It is impossible to say much about the story without giving away vital secrets, sufficient to warn the reader that if he should think this is a romance, he couldn't be more mistaken. I think that is a bit of a spoiler. But anyway, I mean, like, really, really good reviews. Robert Barnard, we've quoted a lot, the best of the late Christies, the plot, a combination of patterns used in Ackroyd and Nile. Um, but yeah, people just really, really love it, which I think is consistent with our view, right?
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. You could just tell
Mhm.
she's been doing this for decades at this point, and she's really honed her craft,
Yeah,
regardless of
Yeah.
whatever genre she dips into.
completely. And the fact that
Well,
she
it's
has
like,
as much flexibility, like at this stage of life, she could just do the same thing again and again, but that she challenges herself to write in this sort of working class man's voice, I think is really interesting.
well, and sort of the really visceral part of it to me is that, there's this whole thing with gypsies and they're notorious for spells, curses. And this book is so
Mm,
spellbinding. It's so insanely captivating from the first chapter, to the very last word in it is, and even in its finality, because it does have quite a bow tied on it at the end. I still wanted more. It's like she's
yeah,
amazing.
I agree. It's a great ending. A great ending. Did any of you get any of the film adaptation? If not, I'll run through them very quickly.
I did not.
There are two adaptations of this. There's a 1972 movie directed by Sidney Gilliat. It's got an all-star cast of its time. So Ellie is played by Hayley Mills. Britt Eklund plays Greta. It's got Hywel Bennett as Mike Rogers, who is very charming and is really good in it, and aforementioned Sher Khan George Sanders as Uncle Andrew, which was his final film, sadly. Apparently, the film got very mixed reviews and was very unsuccessful in the UK and therefore wasn't given a full release in the US, and Agatha Christie herself did not like it. But we watched it today and we thought it was a really good thriller, like really well made. It's very faithful to the novel. A little bit hard to get. I couldn't find it on a streamer, so I actually had to sort of buy the Blu-ray, but I would really, really recommend it. The house that they build, the modern house, is hilarious. It's kind of got like a James Bond there interior. The guy, the architect has this gigantic remote control with which to open shutters. And there's a sort of split floor in the living room that reveals a swimming pool, which is just hilarious. There's also a conveyor belt in the bath to bring out the champagne. So, yeah, it was surprisingly good. So I'd recommend it. And then, as we said before, the final episode, the very final episode of the ITV Marple series with Julia Mackenzie is a Miss Marple shoehorned version of this. It's set in the 50s. The guy playing Mike Rogers is much more dark and brooding. He actually plays Prince Albert in The Young Victoria, if you've watched that. Santonix
Mm.
becomes way younger, and it's a much more explicitly kind of, it's much more explicit that Santonix fancies Mike, and is building the house for him and wants his approval. So they make a lot more of that. A lot more of the kind of the stuff that Agatha Christie was forced to put in from her publishers, so that the family members who become red herrings and maybe other suspects, that's all stripped away. And I think that's a bit of a shame. And actually, we were saying, because we watched them both today, that you miss a lot of the courtship. Well, a lot of that is stripped away. And in a sense, you have to have the courtship because you've got to see how charming he is, and you've got to buy into it as a love story. As Xander said, it is a love story. So I think the film is really worth watching, is what I'll say on that. Okay, well, with that, we will close out the episode. Next time, we'll be covering, probably in a mini pod, the final Tommy and Tuppence book by the pricking of my thumbs. Thank you to Adam, Xander, and Hannah for joining. And stay tuned to after the end credits music for the solution to the novel. Okay, folks, be prepared to be spoiled now. So if you haven't read the book, please look away now. So the solution to this book is that, much like Death on the Nile, this is a love triangle where the innocent party is being played by the supposedly warring other woman and man. So Greta and Mike met in Hamburg. They decided that they both had a taste for expensive things. This is a book about covetousness, right? Mike covets a rich lifestyle. Greta says, well, I'm companion to a quite naive young girl. I can put you in her way, and then all you have to do is charm her and marry her. And then, after a suitable period of time, we'll kill her. She's allergic to horses. She has capsules with her allergy medicine in. We will doctor them with cyanide, and eventually she'll just, fall off her horse one day when riding, and no one will suspect because cyanide in the open air, the smell will go very quickly. Unfortunately, they are found out because Uncle Andrew finds a picture of Mike and Greta, which is clearly from before they would have met Ellie. So that proves it's all a setup. And he sort of goes to pieces. It also turns out that Mike Rogers was bribing the gypsy woman to scare his wife and had killed her because she could have, put the blame on him for what happened to Ellie. And we realize that the first person narrative is his prison confession. So, how did you find the solution? Maybe Adam, because you're the least Agatha Christie literate. I think if you know your Christie, you're kind of prepared for these love triangles where actually the two people are working against the innocent. So that's something that's used again and again and again. So you're primed for it a little bit. You're also primed for capsules being tampered with. Any medication, you probably think, oh, I wonder if someone's tampering with that. And then there's also the big suspicion of, why won't Mike introduce Ellie to his mother? Is it that she knows something? We realize that the mother has suspected that he's a psychopath from when he's very young. So yeah, how did you find the ending? Were you genuinely surprised by it?
Yeah, turns out the mother was on point. Yes, I was. I even until the turn, and I listened to the same audiobook that Hannah got that came with what do you call it? Crooked House, and it was very well performed. And so until the turn where he's like, "Oh, well, of course I did that because," and you're like, "Wait," I had to like stop for a second, and go, "Wait, what?" Because I was waiting for one of the companions, like, oh yeah, Greta's got a thing with her friend, the horse riding friend, or with the mom, or like Greta's obviously got something going on with somebody, and that's what's
Yeah.
gonna be going on. And then as it goes on, and he's like, well, yes, and then I had to push that gypsy woman into the quarry because she was a little, you're like, whoa.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
this, like, because the whole tone is first person narrative, and
Mm.
he comes off a few times as kind of a little odd. He's describing himself and describing the events, and a few things he said is like, well, I have to say it this way. I remember, oh, I barely remember that. And earlier in the book, and you're kind of like, once she dies, you go, oh, okay, because it's because she died, and he's sort of recounting all this. And then when it comes out where he's like, well, yes, and then I realized Greta was a complete vixen that I needed to murder right away. And you're like, whoa, damn,
Yeah, the
dude.
I know.
murders.
I
We
Like
wait
it,
a long time for a murder, but then we get them very frequently, don't we, until the
like
end.
it was weird
I'm
because
pretty
he
sure
was
I backed it
he
up,
basically
like,
was
because I'm
free at
like, I
that point.
misheard that.
I liked how he describes where like suddenly like he had murdered Greta, and he was like, great, I needed to do that. And then, hey, why is everybody else here? Like he doesn't even realize everyone's there, and they're like, all right, buddy, calm down. He's
Yeah.
not even necessarily thinking about how he's caught, or about what you would think, trying to cover it up or whatever. Like his kind of passions overtook him, and he's like, wait, I had this kind of sweet girl that probably would have,
Made me
I had the
happy.
life.
Yeah.
I didn't need to
Mhm.
do any of this. He only realizes it too late, and then he doesn't care anymore, which is also very striking.
But it's also like, I mean, I think it's very important, therefore, to have that childhood murder of the little boy who fell through the
Yeah.
ice and he nicked the wristwatch,
Yeah.
because
Oh
that
yeah,
shows
that.
that there
Yeah,
was
Oh
I didn't
gosh.
that he's
anticipate
been a
that.
psychopath all his life, and it's just with the recent spate of murders he's got a taste for it. But I was saying to Philip that really reminded me of Lord of the Rings and Smeagol and Deagol being murdered for the precious.
Mm.
No, absolutely. Okay, so oh my God, when I was reading that part and he was talking about his first murder, because we had already heard about this story, he was trying to save somebody from the ice. But when he
Mhm.
was talking about it in his confession, I'm just like,
What?
wow, that's kind of beautiful. I hate that.
Right? Like they got me. I was like, this. He was kind of a stand-up doofus, and now he's like murdering children in the ice, like shit.
Yeah.
And then coming off a Penguin, the Penguin finale. I was like, oh
Yeah,
damn,
exactly.
a lot going on here.
I don't know. My view is, although I said to Philip that normally if it was a proper serial killer, the method would be the same. So obviously it's very different to have the cyanide capsules and then strangulation, up close physical murder.
Yes, because
But
poison is a woman's weapon, Bina.
I know, but it does feel a little bit like a spree killing type psychology, where by the end of it, like you say, like it's very cold and calculated with Ellie. Claudia's obviously an unwitting victim. Like they did not intend for her to nick an allergy capsule. And actually, it's the revelation that a second person has died in exactly the same way as Ellie that really causes the suspicion to fall on them, because, what are the chances of that happening? There must therefore be something non-organic and unnatural afoot. And I think actually the hero of the story is really the local village doctor, isn't it, who starts putting two and
Mm.
two together. Or it's kind of the village that's the hero, because it's the people of the village, the doctor and
Right.
Major Phil Potts and the sort of the local Bobby, and who kind of like figure it all out in the end.
I
But by the
guess
end, you're right. I mean, he does have a complete kind of breakdown by the end, I think.
the weirdest part for me is when he's coming back from America after like everything's still very suspicious. Like he's like, "Hey, will you handle the money cuz I don't trust this other guy." And he's like, "Well, I can tell you that as far as the money goes, it will be handled very well." And the guys, and I'm like, "What is?" I'm like, like I think that they're like plotting to fuck him over and like get the
Yeah.
fortune, which of course why wouldn't they be? But he's just sort of like
Somebody's
very
plotting
naive and
something.
like signing it over to them. Yeah, so then
The
but then
weird
when
bit, the
he
weird bit
writes
is when
the
he's
letter
like,
to
and I've sent
Greta.
you a letter. I've sent
Yeah,
you a letter and you'll get it when you get back.
yeah, you're like, well, can't you just tell me now? I'm literally right here. And then he sends the letter to Greta to be like, let her know I want to marry her as soon as I get there. And I'm like, whoa, that's quite a turn. I mean, like, I guess
Right.
like trauma bonding. They both just lost this person. Like,
Well, that's his excuse, isn't it? I wouldn't
no,
have got
It
through it if it
is.
weren't for Greta.
yeah, I'm like, I wouldn't expect that at all. And then like, it doesn't take very long before you realize like he's like, oh no, 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 this was the plan all along. And I'm like, oh, because that was where I was like, something's not right. He's like wanting to marry Greta all of a sudden. I'm like, that's not going to go over well. Then
Well,
he just
she's
So,
murders
very
her.
hot, so
so
there
Well,
we
I
go.
look, I don't blame him for that, but you can't trust her.
I really felt reading this like the first the intro chapter is just like a weird epilogue or not epilogue, prologue.
Hmm.
But when reading it, I was like, this is a very strange Agatha Christie book, like structurally. And it
Yeah, very
almost
much
felt,
so.
yeah, exactly. It felt almost more akin to like something Stephen King would kind of
Oh,
introduce his
okay.
books as. But in hindsight, like after finishing the book, it's almost like a Chuck Palahniuk book, if that makes sense.
Haven't read his work since my early 20s, so but
I
I'll have
mean,
to go.
neither have I, but like it is
But your early
it
20s are probably less long ago than for me.
oh, I don't know. I'm 67. Who knows?
Oh dear. But yeah, the tone, I think that's why this book is so popular, right? Because the tone is so slippery. And we can describe it as a romance, a thriller, a bits of a puzzle book, a kind of psychological serial, not serial, yeah, maybe like a spree killer book. I think it's its strength. I think it's why so many people respond to it. And the tone is just so unbelievably creepy and sinister, especially by the end, for sure.
Very
Anything
uncomfortable.
yeah. Anything else to say on this lovely book before we bring it to a close?
Definitely, I would definitely recommend it and any Agatha Christie read you want to do. Like I love
Mm,
Poirot, but this is a great one.
this is a great one. I agree. We've got one final absolute banger of a Poirot coming up, Curtain, which actually wrote in the 40s. So that's the final one to really look forward to. The next one is Halloween Party, which is actually it's not bad. It's just very by the numbers, I would say. But Curtain is great.
I
We- We've got another terrible spy thriller coming up, Passenger to Frankfurt, which is just awful.
I think even if you have a hard copy of this book, the Hugh Fraser audiobook is worth checking out because the performance is just so great. And then
Yeah,
the
will do.
BBC did a radio play version of it that I didn't hear the whole thing, but it's also very good.
Perfect. Will do. All right, then, folks. Thank you so much for joining for this lovely full discussion of Endless Night. Like I said, the next one is going to be a mini pod by the pricking of my thumbs if you're following along at home. And then we have Halloween Party and a few other of the really the late 60s, early 70s Agatha. And they start becoming a little bit sad because you can see maybe dementia kicking in. But we do then round out with the very strong final two that she had written in the 40s and saved for her final years. So we're definitely on the home stretch. We're in the single digits of novels left to go. And join us next time for Tommy and Tuppence. Okay, folks, have a good one. Bye.
Love you, Bina. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye,
Thank
Yeah,
everyone.
thanks,
you.
Bina, for having me. It's a lot of fun.
Oh, great. Hopefully, you'll make another one.
Thank you.